Hey everyone, thank you for joining me in this latest installment of Ask Mitch. As always, please send any questions you have to Mitch at northwoodcc.org. Keep your questions to 100 words or less so that I can try my best to answer them succinctly. Today's question comes from someone's Bible reading. And they have a question about Titus chapter 2, verse 15. The ESV translates it this way. Declare these things, exhort and rebuke with all authority. Let no one disregard you. Now, other translations translate that last phrase as, let no one despise you. And the question is simply this. What does it mean to let no one despise you? And how do we apply that today? Well, I think one of the best ways to get at what it means to let no one despise you or disregard you is actually to look back at another passage that has the exact same admonition. This is found in 1 Timothy chapter 4. We saw this in our 1 Timothy series, but in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, Paul writes to Timothy, let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct, and love and faith and purity. Now, what both of these letters have in common is that Paul is writing to pastors that he has sent to faithfully preach, teach, and pastor congregations that are rife with division, that have often embraced false teaching, that are not submitting themselves to God's word. And what he has exhorted both Titus and Timothy to do is to exercise authority over those churches by faithfully teaching and preaching God's word and by magnifying the gospel of Jesus Christ. And now, what Paul is anticipating is that there will be some in those churches who will not like the message they're hearing. And they'll want to reject the faithful teaching of God's word. They'll want to reject the message that God has entrusted to Titus and Timothy. And so, as a result, they'll look for any possible way they can to dismiss that message. And so, Paul is urging these two pastors to give people no reason to disregard you, to have no reason to disregard them, and therefore be able to disregard the message they're preaching. And so we find most clearly what that means for Timothy to live out is Paul's admonition, let no one despise you, but set the believers an example. In Timothy's case, Paul was worried that the church might use his youth, his inexperience, as a reason to dismiss the messages he was preaching and teaching from God's word. And so he exhorts Timothy, do your best to be an example in your conduct, to let the message you're preaching match the message that you're living out day to day to day. Give people no reason to disregard you, to despise you, or to disregard the message. And so this is a call then, first and foremost, to pastors, elders, to those who have been in charge with the responsibility of faithfully teaching God's people, to make sure that their character matches their message, that people would have no reason to disregard the faithful teaching of God's word because of their character, because of their example. But the second admonition is to remember that these letters would have been read publicly in the churches that Timothy and Titus were preaching. And so in encouraging Timothy and Titus not to let anyone despise them, the church would also be hearing, let no one despise you. And the meaning then for all of us is, don't look for a way to avoid hearing and submitting to God's word simply because of the person who's preaching it to you. In Timothy's case, they might have been tempted to dismiss what he was saying because he was young. In Titus's case, we don't know why the congregation would have been tempted to dismiss what Titus was saying. But here Paul is saying, by saying, let no one despise you for what you're teaching, he's encouraging the congregation also then not to dismiss the faithful preaching and teaching of God's word because of the messenger who is delivering it. So there you have it. I think that's what this passage means and gives us two different applications. For those who are entrusted with faithfully teaching God's word, make sure that the conduct of your life matches the message you're preaching so that people can't find a reason to dismiss the message. But for those who are receiving God's word, don't dismiss the message because you found some reason to dismiss the messenger. Whether that is their character, or it's their youth, or it's something they're saying that you simply don't like, because then the problem ultimately is You've got a problem with God's word, not with the messenger. So I hope that's helpful to you. And until next time, I love you, I miss you, and I hope this is a blessing to you.